Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Stranger in the House. Jessica had always been the responsible type. At 19, while other college students were out partying, she spent her evenings curled up with textbooks or taking care of other people's kids. Babysitting wasn't just a way to earn a few extra bucks. It was something she genuinely enjoyed. It gave her a sense of peace. That was until one particular evening when everything she knew about safety and comfort was turned upside down. It was a chilly autumn evening when Jessica arrived at the Anderson family's home. She had only met the parents briefly at the interview, but they seemed nice enough. The house was large, tucked away on a quiet street at the edge of town. The kind of house that looked like it could have been from another era. 3 stories tall, with a stone exterior and a front door that creaked as if it had a life of its own. "Thanks so much for doing this on such short notice," Mrs. Anderson had said as she welcomed Jessica in. "Our regular sitter had to cancel, and we just really need to get out tonight." "No problem," Jessica had smiled. "I'll take good care of the kids." Her shift started just like any other babysitting job. The kids, Ethan and Lily, were both around 7 and 9, respectively, well-behaved, with that energy you'd expect from children their age. They quickly warmed to Jessica, showing her their toys and telling her about their favorite cartoons. She wasn't worried at all. As the evening wore on, the parents made their quick exit, leaving Jessica to watch over the house. She settled on the couch with a book, the soft hum of the house the only noise in the background. The lights were dimmed, and the only source of illumination came from the flickering television. Around 9:30 p.m., after tucking the kids into bed, Jessica began to notice something odd. A faint sound, a soft, deliberate thump, echoed through the hallway. It was as if someone was walking, but there was no reason for it. The children were both in their rooms, tucked under the blankets, sound asleep. Thinking it was nothing more than the old house settling, Jessica continued reading. But the sound came again, closer this time. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. It wasn't the creaking of old wood. These were steps, human steps. Probably just the pipes, Jessica murmured to herself, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. But then, the sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable. Someone was walking through the hall. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood up, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest phone, her hand trembling as she dialed Mrs. Anderson's number. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. She crept toward the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But the hall was empty. No one was there. The footsteps stopped. Jessica's eyes darted from one end of the hallway to the other, but there was no sign of anyone. The house was eerily silent again. The only noise now the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Maybe it was just her imagination. She decided to check on the kids, just to be sure they were still asleep. She walked quietly down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When she reached Ethan's room, she peered in through the cracked door. Both children were asleep, just as she had left them. Ethan was sprawled out on his bed, while Lily curled up with her favorite stuffed bear. Her heart started to calm. It was just her nerves playing tricks on her. But as she turned to leave, the footsteps returned. This time, they were unmistakable. Someone was walking up the stairs, slow, deliberate, and steady. Jessica froze. She couldn't deny it any longer. Someone was in the house. She bolted back to the children's room. She didn't care if it was the wind or the house settling. Whatever was happening, it wasn't safe. Her pulse raced, her hands shaking as she locked the door behind her. "Stay quiet," she whispered to the kids. Both children stirred, but when they saw the panic in Jessica's eyes, they nodded and clutched their blankets tighter. She crouched down in front of the door, trying to steady her breath. The footsteps grew louder, the creaks of the floorboards more pronounced. Whoever was up, there was moving through the upper floors of the house, taking slow, methodical steps as if they were trying to find her. Her thoughts raced. Should she call the police? Should she run? No, she couldn't leave the kids alone. She didn't know if this was a prank or if someone had really broken in, but she had to protect them. Then the footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, no sound at all, just silence. The kind of silence that made her skin crawl. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. Jessica held her breath, listening for anything, any hint of movement. But there was nothing. The entire house was still. She glanced at the children, who were staring at her, wide-eyed, their faces pale with fear. Minutes passed before the front door creaked open downstairs. Mrs. Anderson's voice echoed from below. "Jessica, is everything okay?" Jessica's relief was almost overwhelming. She rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste to reach the front door. She opened it to find Mrs. Anderson and her husband standing in the doorway, smiles on their faces. "What happened? You look pale as a ghost," Mr. Anderson remarked, noticing her distressed expression. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. She was still too shaken. I think there's someone in the house." "What?" "No one else is here," Mrs. Anderson said, furrowing her brow. "There's no way someone could have gotten in." Jessica followed them back inside, her mind spinning with the fear of what had just happened. But as she turned to head back to the children's room, she froze. Her eyes widened as she saw something that hadn't been there before, the attic door. It was slightly ajar. Jessica felt her blood run cold. "We don't go up there," Mrs. Anderson said, noticing Jessica's gaze. "The attic door doesn't work properly. I don't even know where the key is. We haven't used it in years." A cold shiver ran down Jessica's spine. The attic door had been securely locked when the Andersons had left. "How is it open now? You said you didn't touch it?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course not," Mrs. Anderson replied. "We've never opened it." Jessica turned toward the children's room, her mind racing. What was going on? The footsteps, the cold draft, the door, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a prank. Before she could voice her fears, Mrs. Anderson looked down at the ground, her face turning ashen. "There's something we should have told you before. The last sitter we had, she went missing. She vanished without a trace, just like that." Jessica's stomach dropped. Her heart hammered in her chest. What had she gotten herself into? The Andersons exchanged uneasy glances. "We thought it was just a fluke," Mr. Anderson continued. "But after everything that's happened tonight, Jessica couldn't speak. The weight of what had just happened, and the realization that she might not have been alone in the house, settled heavily on her shoulders. Something had been in that house with her. Something or someone that didn't belong. And whatever it was still out there waiting. Story 2. The phone call. Sarah sat on the worn leather couch in the living room of the Smiths' house, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background as the house settled into its quiet night. She'd been babysitting for the Smiths for the past 2 weeks, and tonight was no different. The children, 6-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Emily, had been put to bed after a fun-filled evening of cartoons and snacks. Sarah had just tucked them in, kissed their foreheads, and whispered a quick goodnight, leaving the lights dimmed and the soft lullaby of the night taking over. It was past 10 p.m., and Sarah glanced at her watch, preparing to head home. The Smiths had gone out to a late dinner, and it was a short shift. Just a few more minutes and she could leave. She had already cleaned up the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and made sure the door was locked behind her. The evening had gone smoothly, no crying or fussing from the kids, just peace and quiet. She pulled her phone from her pocket, checking for any missed messages. As her fingers swiped across the screen, the house was still. The air was cool, and the only sound was the quiet creak of the floorboards as the old house seemed to settle. Then, her phone rang. Sarah didn't recognize the number, but that wasn't unusual. She'd gotten calls from unknown numbers before. She didn't think twice as she pressed the green button to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice casual, almost dismissive. The kids were sound asleep, and she was ready to leave. The voice on the other end was distorted, eerie in its unfamiliarity, but there was something about it that made her pause. It wasn't a robotic voice, but it wasn't entirely human either. It sounded wrong. The words were too clear, too precise. "We're watching you." Her heart skipped a beat. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened as she tried to shake off the feeling that crawled up her spine. It was probably just a prank call, some bored teenager messing around. She chuckled softly to herself, trying to calm the sudden unease that threatened to rise within her. "Very funny," she said, her voice steady but tinged with annoyance. "Who is this?" But the voice on the other end didn't respond with the usual snicker of a prankster. It only said, in the same eerie, distorted tone, "The kids are asleep in their beds. You should leave now." Sarah's blood ran cold. Her mind raced, scrambling for logic. How could anyone know that the kids were asleep? She hadn't said a word to anyone about her plans for the night. The Smiths were gone. No one should have known she was alone in the house. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It had only been 10 minutes since she'd tucked the kids in, and they'd been so quiet. Had something happened? Her eyes darted to the hallway that led to the children's bedrooms. The house felt unnervingly still now, as if it had taken on a life of its own. "Who is this?" she demanded again, her voice wavering ever so slightly. She was trying to stay calm, but something was very wrong. The voice on the other end only breathed heavily, like someone was standing far too close to the receiver. "Leave now." Her skin prickled. She could feel the weight of the words in her chest, a pressure building that made it hard to breathe. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind. Was it one of the parents calling? No, they had left their phones on the counter by the door. She could see them clearly when she'd entered the house. It wasn't them. So who? The voice continued, growing more insistent, more chilling. "You should leave now, before it's too late." Without thinking, Sarah jumped up from the couch and headed toward the hallway. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears, the fear creeping up her spine like a cold hand. She tried to shake it off, but the words lingered in her mind, repeating like an echo. Something was wrong. The phone call ended suddenly, cutting off mid-breath, leaving only the silence in its wake. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, staring toward the children's rooms. The house was too quiet now, too still. Her first instinct was to check on the kids. They were supposed to be asleep, but as she reached for the door to Emily's room, she hesitated. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. There was something about the stillness in the air now, something that made the hairs on her arms rise in alarm. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open to Ethan's room. Empty. Her breath caught in her throat. The bed was perfectly made, the blankets untouched. There was no sign of him. She quickly moved to Emily's room, but the result was the same. The bed was neatly made, and there was no trace of either of the kids. Panic surged in her chest. The voice had been right. The kids were no longer in their beds. The house suddenly felt even colder, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the air. Her fingers trembled as she turned toward the stairway that led to the attic. A sudden chill swept through the room, brushing past her skin like icy fingers. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the temperature dropped, and she froze. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Something was terribly wrong. She turned slowly, almost afraid of what she might see. And there, standing in the dim light of the hallway, were figures. Shadows. People. At first, Sarah thought they were the kids, but as her eyes focused, she realized they were much taller. Much too tall. The figures were blurry, their outlines indistinct, but she could make out their eyes. Empty, black holes staring straight at her, unblinking. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching her. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls of the house were closing in on her. Sarah's pulse raced, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Fear had taken over her body. The shadows in the hallway shifted slightly, their forms growing clearer, the eerie figures now unmistakably human in shape, though not entirely. It was as if they were cloaked in darkness, blending with the very essence of the night. Her legs finally moved, taking her back toward the front door. She needed to get out. She needed to leave. As she fumbled for her keys, she glanced once more toward the hallway, but the figures were gone. The house was silent again, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah thought maybe it had all been a nightmare, a trick of her mind. But the dread still lingered in the air, thick and heavy. She turned the lock on the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air hit her face, but the fear wouldn't let go. She didn't even check her phone as she rushed down the steps, not stopping until she was safely in her car. As she drove away, Sarah's thoughts were a blur. The phone call, the children, the figures. She couldn't explain any of it. But one thing was clear in her mind. The house had never felt so wrong, so alive in a way that made her skin crawl. And somewhere, deep in her bones, Sarah knew the truth. The phone call hadn't been a prank. Someone or something had been watching her, and it wasn't done yet. Story 3. The Locked Door. Laura had been babysitting for as long as she could remember. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills and gave her a few hours to herself while the parents were out. She had always been fine with the quiet routine of sitting in someone else's house, watching over kids, and cleaning up after their mess. She had been hired to babysit the Green family's 2 children, Toby, a 3-year-old, and little Ella, a newborn. The Greens had just moved into a large, old house on the edge of town. It wasn't one of those modern suburban houses you see in all the new neighborhoods. No, this one had a long history, and Laura could tell it just by looking at it. The house had an eerie, weathered charm with its peeling paint, cracked windows, and the unmistakable air of age about it. When she first arrived, Mrs. Green had greeted her at the door with a warm smile, trying to hide the unease she felt about leaving her children with someone she hardly knew. "You'll be fine here," Mrs. Green reassured Laura. "Ella's asleep, and Toby's easy to handle. Just make sure the baby's crib is locked, okay? And please, whatever you do, don't go near the attic. The door's been sticking lately, but I don't want anyone messing with it. It's tricky." Laura nodded, trying to mask her curiosity about the attic. It wasn't often that people mentioned specific areas of their homes with such odd warnings. "Don't worry, Mrs. Green," Laura smiled. "I'll make sure everything is fine. You enjoy your night out." With that, Mrs. Green left, and Laura was left alone in the house. The house felt old, the kind that creaked with every step, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The kitchen was on the left, the living room straight ahead, and the staircase leading up to the bedrooms to the right. Lara's first order of business was to settle Toby, who had a habit of staying up past his bedtime. "Come on, buddy. Time for bed," Laura said gently to Toby, who was playing with his toy trucks on the living room rug. "I don't want to go to bed," Toby whined. Laura smiled and knelt down beside him. "How about a story before bed?" Toby's face brightened, and he nodded. She began to read to him as the minutes ticked by. The house was quiet except for the occasional distant creak of the floorboards above. Laura couldn't help but wonder if it was just her imagination or if the house truly had its own voice. After a while, Toby drifted off to sleep, his tiny body curled up under a blanket. Laura turned off the living room light and headed upstairs to check on Ella. The baby's nursery was at the end of the hallway. Laura softly opened the door to find the baby sleeping soundly in her crib. She checked the baby monitor just to be sure, and then quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Everything seemed peaceful. The night had been uneventful, just the way Laura liked it. She sat down in the living room with a book in hand, prepared to pass the time while the children slept. But then, just as the quiet settled in, Laura heard something faint, something that didn't belong. A soft cry, the kind of cry you might hear from a baby waking up in the middle of the night. Laura froze, listening closely. Was that Ella? No. Ella was still asleep in her crib. Laura was certain of it. The cry came again, this time more distant, faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from above, the attic. Laura shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of her mind. The old house must have been settling, or maybe the wind was causing something to creak. She tried to ignore the sound, but then the cry came again, louder this time. It echoed down the hallway, reverberating through the walls. With a deep breath, Laura stood up, telling herself that she was being silly. She walked upstairs and checked on the baby once more. Ella was still peacefully asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Laura checked the time. It was nearly midnight. She felt a shiver run down her spine, the air in the house turning cold despite the heater running. She decided to go into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea, hoping it would calm her nerves. As she walked down the hallway toward the stairs, she heard it again, the soft crying. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just the sound of a baby's cry. There was something unnatural about it. It sent a chill down her spine. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her instincts told her to ignore it, to go back to her tea and try to forget the strange noise. But curiosity got the better of her. Laura slowly walked down the hallway toward the attic door. It was at the very end of the hallway, near the stairs. She hesitated, staring at the old wooden door that led up to the attic. It had been locked when she first arrived, just as Mrs. Green had said. But now, the door was cracked open. Lara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't touched the door, and yet there it was ajar. She could feel the presence of something cold, something that didn't belong. She could almost feel eyes watching her. The crying grew louder now, echoing in her ears as if it was right there in the attic. Her breathing quickened. Her hands trembled. What was happening? Why was the attic door open? Before she could think it through, Laura found herself stepping closer to the door. She pushed it open, heart racing, dreading what she might find. As the door creaked, she was met with a rush of cold air, unnaturally cold, as though the house itself had swallowed her breath. The attic stairs loomed in front of her, leading up into the dark void. She hesitated, but the cry, now unmistakably coming from the attic, pulled her forward. With shaky steps, Laura climbed the stairs, the sound of the crying growing louder and more frantic with every step. It was coming from the corner of the attic, but the darkness was so thick that she couldn't see anything. She reached for the light switch, but her fingers froze in midair as something cold brushed against her arm. The cry stopped abruptly. Lara's heart thundered in her chest. She was no longer sure if it was the cry of a baby or something else entirely. Something older. And then, her eyes caught something in the corner of the attic. She gasped in horror. There, on an old, dusty shelf, was a photo album. It was worn, the cover faded from age, and dust clung to its edges. But it wasn't the album that terrified her. It was the photograph inside. She pulled it out with trembling hands and stared at the black and white image. It was a family picture, just like the ones you might see in any house. A smiling couple, 2 children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes. But there was something terribly wrong with it. One figure in the photo didn't belong. A woman in a strange, vintage dress stood at the far side of the family, her face almost hidden in the shadows. But her eyes were wide open and staring directly at Laura. Not at the camera, but at her. Laura felt her breath catch in her throat as a cold sweat formed on the back of her neck. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. It was as if the woman in the photo had stepped out of the frame and was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Suddenly, The attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Laura spun around, but there was no one there. Only darkness and the faintest sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the old house. She backed away slowly, the photo album still clutched in her hand, and her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She had to find the children and leave before whatever was in the house found her. But as she turned to leave, the attic lights flickered and went out. The crying began again, this time louder, almost as if it was right behind her. And that's when she knew. It wasn't the baby crying at all.